I've recorded this 4 times now, and every single time I've run into a completely different technical issue. So I really hope that this all works out, because if it doesn't, my God. I've started this channel in 2015 with my friend Brian. We did live reactions of shows that were coming out on the season, and then we would talk about its writing, its composition, and, you know, its animation, what it might mean, its thematics, and so on and so forth. And people hated it for a lot of really good reasons, right? Because we were kind of assholes about it. Now that it's 5 years, the content has changed. And the content changing means that in the process of making a lot of different content, because you're gonna be making a lot of stuff, right? When you're making things over time, and not everything that you're gonna be making is gonna be something that you're 100% confident in making. But one of the things I want to look at are actually 3 things. 3 stories, 3 ideas, 3 videos, 3 arguments. All of them that have never been put into a video. So I'm going to talk about them here. I'm going to talk about them in a little bit of a sort of a rushed fashion, because, you know, this is my 4th time doing it now. But in addition to that, I also want to talk about why I didn't end up doing them. And hopefully, maybe people out there will find a little bit of stuff, you know, some interesting stuff in the meantime. One. Overlord kind of has a really special place in my heart. Overlord was one of the first shows I covered when I first started in 2015, when we first started doing live reactions, but we ended up moving away from live reactions, partly because we got a lot of shit from the Overlord communities. One of the comments actually was that, you know, one of the things is that they didn't want to sit through an hour and a half of us talking about a 20-minute episode, and it would have been better if we just focused on doing it in 5 minutes or so. Just get the main thrust out and just leave it at that. And we thought, hey, that's a good idea. And that's how we ended up doing these sorts of videos. I ended up doing a video on Overlord in regards to its fight structure. One of the things that's important when we're talking about the way in which fights are presented within a narrative is that how they're presented actually kind of creates a sort of language, a sort of beat to them. And as a result, what they're doing is actually very important. Overlord, I argued, actually had a really similar fight language in terms of all of its major fights in the first season. And therefore, as a result, it kind of can tell us a little bit about Ainz's mentality when he's doing these fights. There's actually another argument, though, in which I think you can make for Overlord that's pretty interesting. I think Overlord is actually pretty interesting when we're talking about it in the context of disciplinary power. So, let me back off for a second here. I think we're going to have to talk about the panopticon. So Jeremy Bentham, right, devises this structure. It's this prison where there's this tower in the center, and then surrounding the tower is this sort of like conical what? Surrounding the tower, there's this structure, and inside the structure there are the prisoners, and they're all locked up. The guard can see all of these prisoners, but the prisoners can't actually see the guard. The guard is actually obscured from actual vision. And so the idea here, right, is that the prisoners in these cells, in effect, can't see the guard, and therefore, at any given moment, the guard could be looking into their cells. Now, this is a really naive way of thinking about how prison discipline might work, right? But it's actually really interesting when we're talking about it in terms of power. Disciplinary power. And what I mean by this is the belief that power actually doesn't simply exist as somebody who exercises it, but it's actually an interlocking thing. It's a thing that's yielded by multiple people in multiple instances, and the way in which we think of ourselves as subjects aren't actually just us fully formed or as a result of something that's just out there and that we can reach to some greater truth, but rather all of it is defined by a series of power relationships, and these exist in a sort of unclear network that can be very hard to pin down. So why is this particularly important in the context of Overlord? Well, that's kind of what Ainz is doing. Ainz is actually a really interesting character because one of the things that he kind of has to deal with is he has to juggle the expectations of his guardians, his servants, and the expectations of all the people around him.
問題ないわ。これらすべてアインズ様の計画に沿った行動に過ぎないのですから。ですよね、アインズ様。
その通りだ。
It's never actually challenged or questioned as to what the consequences, the large consequences, of him breaking those expectations are, because he never actually wants to break them. So in this case, the Guardians actually exercise a particular kind of power over Ainz. Even though Ainz is this King of Kings character, you know, he's the last of the supreme beings to survive, he nevertheless is actually a byproduct of these expectations. They expect or demand a series of things from him, even though they constantly prostrate themselves before him. And in return, Ainz internalizes those demands, and he thinks about the ways in which he can present himself that are good, that are righteous, that are effective. Not necessarily righteous, I guess, but the ways in which he believes that it would be a good idea to do that. It would be a good idea to conquer and sort of try and find other players by working in these specific ways. And it really goes into it when we're talking about Ainz as a sort of salaryman. Satoru Suzuki, right, was formerly a salaryman. And he had to use a lot of his salaryman mentality, but by bringing over the salaryman mentality, he also kind of brings over the salaryman antecedents, particularly the idea that there are specific ways and specific registers to do specific things. And Overlord is fundamentally chock full of that. And it's funny because it never gets really questioned. I think we can sort of think about this in the context of Michel Foucault in regards to power/knowledge. So Foucault is talking about power-knowledge as an interlocking thing. Power and knowledge comes together. Knowledge is dependent on truth regimes. This idea that things are interlocked with these set of expectations and natural commonsensical beliefs about what is true, what is right, what is the proper thing. And as a result, power is thus exercised in the name of trying to get to that particular truth. And so in this case, right, Ainz's behavior is actually quite interesting because he's already made a claim. He's already made stakes about what he believes to be the right way to act. And the Guardians aren't immune from this. The Guardians also believe that there's a right way to act. They constantly shower him in adulations because they just naturally believe it's the truth to them that he's just that good. So why did I not go with that argument for Overlord? It's actually a fairly straightforward and simple reason. One of the things that's important about these regimes is that they're really, really effective when they're really hard to pick out. And Overlord, unfortunately, is a good example, primarily because it's so clear about it, but at the same time, it's also a bad example because it's so clear about it. It's better to think of a show in the context of something that normalizes and naturalizes a set of expectations and truths that end up leading to shaping individuals, but it's also very hard to parse out when and where and how it's happening, because that's when it's at its most effective. For Overlord, it's so fundamentally clear, and I think it's probably a byproduct of Maruyama Kugane's writing style, more so than any sort of fault or claim about the nature of power itself. Intermission. I know a lot of you probably don't get to the end of my videos and see my random thoughts about random things or whatnot, so I'm going to be doing my recommendations right now. Check out the Sin Clinic. He's a fun dude. He's hilarious. He knows a lot of Simpsons quotes, a lot more than I do. He's also made a video recently that I think is really good, that is a sort of retrospective about what it necessarily means to make a list about the decade, because a decade is a really long time. And so as a result, the important thing in regards to discussing the decade is what is the mentality, what is the mindset, what is the belief, what is the thought process that we would have at that particular moment in the decade. And is it different from our particular moment now when we're actually making the list? He's also like dying in Japan, which I think is, you know, kind of hilarious in a lot of different ways. So the second video is Erased. Now, I've done 2 videos on Erased already. The first one is a video about Erased in regards to Japan's prosecutory as well as its police force and this concept of guilty until proven guilty, and how that sort of portrays a really interesting but also potentially, well, not potentially, very much so, problematic way in which Japanese justice is oftentimes carried out, especially considering that Japan is one of the few OECD countries left with the death penalty. The second one is also the way in which we might think of the limitations of purely formal analysis, simply because if we remove something in terms of its pure context, then what ends up happening is we end up finding a really interesting set of perspectives, but those that are also kind of disturbing. So in that context, I use the case of the mother as well as the serial killer. The mother's monologue transitioning into Yashiro's narration completely seamlessly is really effective. But it's mainly effective primarily because we already understand the context that underlines it. And context, therefore, is really important. So if we're going to talk about context, right, let's talk about context of something else. And that is the killer. There's something really fascinating about Erased and its killer, primarily because I think it might be making a reference to Tsutomu Miyazaki. Side note, one of the things that's important is that if you're not familiar with Tsutomu Miyazaki, I did make a video with Patrick Galbraith about it called The Other Miyazaki. What's really important in the context of Erased and Tsutomu Miyazaki is that the killer in Erased, in the very specific time period that he struck that specific town, makes actually kind of a lot of similarities. There's quite a few similarities that are pretty notable to point out, you know. One, both of them seem to have hit during the early Eisei period. And that's actually really important, and I'm going to get back to that a little bit later. 2, both of the killers seem to have targeted girls, or at least in the case of Yashiro, he targeted some girls, and then he targeted a boy who looked like a girl to throw the police off their trail. But nevertheless, it was a female-leaning kind of set of murders. 3, both of them ended up having disastrous consequences to people whom were essentially thrown under the bus by the mainstream media or community, but functionally didn't have that much to do with the murders. In the case of Tsutomu Miyazaki, that would have been the Rorikon otaku and the otaku at large by the mainstream media.
This kind of stood out to a lot of reporters who began to sort of talk about this dangerous, again, a dangerous population, and that became known as the otaku generation, Miyazaki as an otaku, but also kind of the specter of the otaku killer. So to return to some of the earlier things we were discussing, the kind of population, the dangerous population.
And in the case of Erased, that would have been Jun Shiratori. I want to mention that I'm not the only one who's made this argument. Paradise Agent, I believe that's his YouTube channel name, he makes a reference to Tsutomu Miyazaki in his video on Erased, but there's also a blog by the name of Sono Speedo Day, upon which the author makes a really fascinating comparison in terms of Erased, Miyazaki, and the girl who leapt through time. And it's a really fascinating and really short look at in terms of the sci-fi time travel convention and what that necessarily means. One of the things that the author mentions is really important is that even with his execution in 2008, Tsutomu Miyazaki, he was incredibly influential. But why is that the case? And it's not just otaku. Tsutomu Miyazaki hit and was caught during the early Heisei. He was caught during the early Heisei period. And therefore, it's incredibly important because the beginning of the period began with the murders. And we know it gets worse. We have the Nikkei stock crash, and then we have the Great Hanshin quake, and then we have the Om Shinrikyo attack. One of the things that's really important to note in that context is that when we sort of group that in relation to the time travel story, this isn't the first time. Pun intended. Sono Speedo Day makes a comparison between Erased and the girl who leapt through time. It was originally a story by Yasutaka Tsutsui, which was about the Minamata poisoning incident. It was largely about interrogating environmental concerns, especially as Japan was starting to form into a modern economy. But In regards to our discussion, it's also interesting in the context of Mamoru Hosoda, because the times affect the way in which time jump stories can be thought of. And in the case of Mamoru Hosoda and the girl who leapt through time, Ian Condry notes, Makoto could control her leaps because she was a young woman in Japan, and in Japan today, young women had more sense of their ability to control their own destinies.
全部話してくれたよ。千秋の住む時代のこととか。
But whereas Hosoda, building off of Tsutsui, was focusing on one group of people, it seemed to me that the erased author, Sanbei, was focusing on an entirely different group of people. The otaku, particularly at the time of the murders. So, if, like in the case of Hosoda's film, we can look back and interrogate these concerns through the power of hindsight, then if we take that framework and apply it to Erased, what do we think it's saying? I think it's a rather simple argument. That what happened at that time was miserable. That the people who were thrown under the bus at that time is unfortunate and they didn't deserve to be. I think Erased is kind of a really fascinating treatise on the belief that otaku can actually have completely conterminous sexual preferences. That they don't necessarily have to equate fantasy with reality, but they can separate them entirely. And you can see it in Jun. Jun goes on to live a completely normal life. That even though he had this fascination with, I believe it was Joshi Kosei, but even though he has this particular fascination, ultimately at the end of the day, he's not a threat. He was never a threat. I think in this sense, for Erased, Yashiro is the person who does not distinguish fantasy from reality. Even though he makes a reference to the spider's thread, it doesn't necessarily mean that what he's actually seeing is actually a spider's thread. It could functionally just be a psychosis. And the same thing is kind of with Miyazaki as well. There's this perception of fantasy, which then translates into reality. But they're fundamentally unreliable narrators, unable to make these necessary distinctions that keep people like otaku, like Miyazaki, like Yashiro, completely productive members of society. So in the process of editing this video, I'd completely forgotten to explain exactly why I didn't end up going with this argument, especially when there's a lot of other things that we might want to consider. Sanbei, for instance, at the time of the murders, might have actually been in his 40s, or at least his late 30s, and therefore, as a result, he would have had a really indelible memory of exactly what was going on. So the question ends up becoming, why did I not go with this particular argument? And the answer is really kind of simple. It's speculative. I don't know exactly how this sort of maps in relation to all of this other stuff, and for the most part, fundamentally, this is largely a speculation as to what I believe Sanbei might be doing, but without anything to actually corroborate that, that's really all it goes. That's really all it can go, and as a result, I didn't end up going with this argument for that particular reason. But yeah. I think I got everything. I really hope I don't have to add more info in. It'll be in the video description if I do. Another channel I would recommend is KYDB. KYDB makes long-form content every 12 months or so because he takes a really long time to make his videos. But they're absolutely fantastic. They're fun videos, they're great. And if you like to edit and you see KYDB's videos, you can tell how much work goes into them. He's very much a working man's YouTuber, so please check him out. He does a lot of really random stuff, and they're great. Yeah, that's all I got. When we're talking about histories, right? Let's talk about one that's about a lie. The history of a lie, or the lie of history. You can probably guess it. It's Rakugo. Shouwa Genroku Rakugo Shinjuu is probably one of the strongest shows for me to have come out in recent memory. I love the first and second season. It is a phenomenal show. I think, however, it's also really fascinating when you study Rakugo. There's a comment by Original 4 in Mind that I think summarizes this very well. Rakugo, as depicted in Shouwa Genroku Rakugo Shinjuu, is a dystopia. So what the hell does that mean? Well, it's not accurate. If you look at the history of Rakugo, Rakugo did have to deal with quite a few challenges in its history. It did have to deal with challenges from radio, and it also did have to deal with challenges from manzai. You'll say the theaters in which Rakugoka plied their trade definitely were closing down, but not at the rates in which the show was showing. So therefore, the question becomes, what necessarily makes it important in the context of Rakugo? If you look at, for instance, Konatsu laments her inability to practice Rakugo because she's a woman, and that is actually kind of true. Lori Brau, in her ethnographic work on Edoku Rakugo, Tokyo Rakugo, she notes that it's actually still kind of a boys' club, that it's actually really difficult for female hanashika or female rakugoka to actually break into the scene and do well. It's still male-dominated.
私は落語はやらないよ。ひょっとしたらなんて思ったこともあったよ。けどやっぱり違うんだ。落語って男の人が丹精込めて脈々と磨き上げたものでしょ。
But one of the things that's really important is that at the time of Konatsu's lamentation, Kamigata Rakugo based out of Osaka, actually already did have female practitioners, and therefore they could technically still have careers doing these things. Either one of two things is happening. One, there's a sort of unreal world in Shouwa Genroku Rakugo Shinjuu, that it's historically strange and kind of inaccurate, but there's a verisimilitude of it, that everything kind of feels like it's true. But it's not true. And yet at the same time, it's so easy and so capable of tricking us into believing that it's true. And so this is actually really important in the sense of Rakugo, Shogun Roku Rakugo Shinjuu. You can also see it in how Thomas Joshua Young notes that actually in the 60s and early 70s, Rakugo actually underwent a golden age. And thus this golden age is really important because it's a cultural heritage that is being preserved, that it didn't actually die the way in which the show presents it to us. But it's also not all fake. What is it about? What's going on? Well, what's the narrative of Shogun Roku Rakugo Shinjuu? The first season is a story, but it's a story about the death of Genroku. It's a story about a character who stands in for the art form itself. But it's a lie. In the second season, we find out that it turns out that's not exactly what happened, that things felt true, but it's actually not the exact case. And therefore, as a result, the story of Shouwa Genroku Rakugo Shinjuu, it's a lie. But it's also a lie that happens to Rakugoka. But it's also a lie about Rakugo, because Rakugo in Shouwa Genroku Rakugo Shinjuu is a lie. Even in the history of Rakugo, the real world history outside of the show, it also kind of has to deal with that. One of the things that Lori Brau mentions that a huge challenge with Rakugoka is that they have to deal with exactly how much language should be translated for a contemporary audience. And there's actually something interesting that happens. A lot of the times there is a sort of sense of fake authenticity of the historical period in which some of these stories may be based out of. It's jidaigeki. Lori Brau mentions that samurai dramas had a little bit of an influence in terms of how some of these Rakugoka told their stories, that the language is fake authentic because a lot of the people who would be listening to these old tales wouldn't be happy with contemporary Japanese, but they also wouldn't really be able to understand old true Edo or even before that. And therefore, as a result, what ends up happening is a fake authenticity. Jidaigeki are period pieces, but they're period pieces that A, know they're already fake, but B, also set up a kind of verisimilitude of that fakeness. It feels right. It feels sensible. We know it's not necessarily accurate, but it never has to hold up to scrutiny. And therefore, as a result, Rakugo is drawing upon that particular kind of idea, Shouwa Genroku Rakugo Shinjuu. But it's also really important in that that too is a lie. that its subject matter has to fundamentally deal with lies. And therefore, the essence of Rakugo and the essence of Shouwa Genroku Rakugo Shinjuu is not simply Rakugo, but the essence of Rakugo in its history and in how it has to deal and co-opt lies to tell a compelling narrative. These 2 seasons of Shouwa Genroku Rakugo Shinjuu are Rakugo in their bones, but it's not Rakugo in their form. But it's Rakugo in terms of how Rakugo has had to deal with challenges of history, of culture, of all of these facets that are levied against it. It's lies all the way down. Or at least, a lot of it is. So why did I end up not going with that argument? Well, the main reason why is simply because at the time that I had thought of it, the second season hadn't finished yet, and by the time the second season finished, I didn't feel like making a video on it. That was pretty much it. I'm sorry. Thank you everybody for showing up. The third channel recommendation is Gil Lies Here. He makes anime music videos to kind of inscrutable music choices that I don't necessarily understand, but I'm a pretty bad analyst and all, so overall it kind of works out. He's also the most toxic person in the Anitube community, according to the vast majority of people, so what could possibly go wrong? There's a lot of other stuff I never ended up getting to as well. For instance, My Hero Academia and the ideological state apparatus. Louise Althusser talks about the ideological state apparatus really utilizing schools, because schools are good at teaching people how to be good state subjects, not necessarily good adults. And therefore, as a result, it's kind of interesting whenever a school comes out teaching kids how to be good citizens within any kind of fictional text. But it's even more interesting in the case of My Hero Academia. One of the things that's important about My Hero Academia is that these kids are not growing up to learn how to be salaryman or office ladies and so on and so forth. They're learning how to be soldiers. They're learning how to be policemen. And therefore, the role of the school here is to teach them how to be repressive state apparatus units. They're people who are going to learn how to oppress and attack and keep people down in the name of the pre-existing structure. And therefore, as a result, it's a sort of propagandistic kind of text in which it shows a lot of the other characters like Stain, for instance, as sort of morally abject in a lot of different ways, even as their completely inscrutable grand narratives don't really make a lot of sense, but you kind of understand what they're trying to do. They're trying to push back against the system, and the system responds back by throwing child bodies, child soldiers against them. Or at least that's the take I got from it. So why did I end up not doing it? Well, the reason is pretty simple. I got bored with My Hero Academia. Another one I wanted to talk about was Full Moon wa Sagashite. It's a show that runs from 2002 to 2003, 56 episodes, I believe. But it is functionally running over the course of a year, roughly put. And the implication or the effect of running over the course of a year with one episode per week is that it's actually really appropriate when you consider what it's trying to do. Full Moon wa Sagashite is a story about a girl who's dying of throat cancer and wants to meet her friend from a really long period of time ago, so she decides that if she becomes famous, then he'll know it's her, and then she'll reunite with him. And this is actually really important because she's dying of throat cancer, and she's gonna die within the year. And so as a result, the implication of Full Moon is that you are watching this happening. You're watching this girl wither away in the span of a year, and yet she's fighting through this. We think of medium is the message as simply the way in which a sort of thing shows itself towards us. That there is a machine, and that machine simply regurgitates its content, and we should keep mind of that machine as well. But broadcasting is also a very important tool in the way in which mediums get their messages across. In this case, the idea here is that if you watched one episode of Full Moon wa Sagashite every single week for the year, as it was initially intended, odds are you might come to a different conclusion, or it might have a slightly different sensation than what it would have been if you had just binged it. It might not work for everybody. It just might have absolutely no effect at all. I don't know. But what's really important is that when we're talking about the way in which media can shape or be shaped by the things around it, it is important to see how it was initially aired as a really useful vector point in which we can pursue some kind of analysis. We can also extend this, for instance, into Motoko Tanaka's discussion of the augmented reality, especially in the sense of Nichijou-kei or Kuki-kei, the everyday type or the air types. You know, Full Moon essentially kind of preceded a lot of these in 2002 to 2003, and so but nevertheless, it kind of tackled very similar ideas, very similar sentiments, very similar media relationships, but it did so in a very peculiar and yet interesting way, and it was able to do so by leveraging upon its drama. Of course, I never ended up going that direction because at the time I made that video, I was kind of stupid. I'm gonna give this video, I think I'm gonna give this video like a really alienating title, like that nobody really understands, and I assume it would just piss Isaac off. That'd be pretty funny. While the patron credits are rolling up here, I want to read a passage, a really cool passage, I think. Just a month before his film won the Palme d'Or at the 1980 Cannes International Film Festival, Kurosawa Akira performed a historic snub at the glamorous Tokyo premiere of Kagemusha. As film producer and media mogul Kadokawa Haruki approached the legendary director to congratulate him, Kurosawa coldly turned away and refused to speak with him, with the room looking on in embarrassment and shock. Yet, presumably, most of the onlookers understood the reason for Kurosawa's chill-inducing rebuff. Against the odds and seemingly out of nowhere, Kadokawa Haruki had transformed how the film and media business in Japan operated, and he did so to tremendous financial success. For the media industry, Kadokawa was the man who introduced what he called media mix strategies and who crafted an entirely new system of media production and consumption. For Kurosawa, the larger part of established film criticism and the old school film industry, Kadokawa had begun the process of spectacularly demolishing the high art of cinema. Even more than that, what he produced was not even cinema anymore. In fact, it was difficult to determine exactly what it was and what it was becoming. That was the opening paragraph of Alexander Zoltan's The End of Japanese Media. It's a fantastic book. I strongly recommend anybody who is interested in media mixes as well as film in general, Japanese film in general, to really take a look at it. I also recommend a really good book, really fantastic book on the idea of Japanese film, The Cinema of Actuality, which takes a lot more look at avant-garde filmmaking. It's by Yuriko Furuhata. Did I say her name right? I really hope I said. I did say her name right. Awesome.